Hey everybody, Pastor Jay here. Just sending out a quick video follow-up from Sunday's sermon. Every once in a while we touch on topics on Sunday, and because there are certain time constraints and because of the breadth of what I wanted to say on Sunday, sometimes we aren't able to go under the surface as deep as maybe we should. And today is one of those occasions, so I thought I'd just send a little follow-up to go a little deeper on a few things that we touched on Sunday. And on Sunday, if you weren't there, we were in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 16, and we were looking at Jesus, after a night of prayer, choosing 12 disciples who would be sort of his core ministry team moving forward that he would invest in for the next 3 years. And we addressed three questions in particular. The first question, why 12? And Jesus was making a connection between the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament and how he was sort of the fulfillment. He himself was the new Israel, and choosing 12. We also looked at the question of why Judas in particular, Judas Iscariot, the one who would betray him a little further down the road before his crucifixion. And so we spent some time digging into why would Jesus choose Judas. And third question is why these 12 in particular? Why not some men or women that seem to be a little more qualified, a little more refined? And yet we know that God's nature is that he looks at the heart. And he would rather have people with open hearts to follow him than having nice, neat resumes or PhDs, etc. And so the one thing that we addressed briefly on Sunday, and I want to go a little deeper, is just revisiting in the context of Judas. Was Judas predestined? Was he fated to betray Jesus? And what consequences does that lead to if we have that as our theology? This sort of micromanaging God who fates people and predestines people either for life or for death or for specific purposes. How do we reconcile that with the God we see in Jesus? We addressed that on Sunday. And also I want to go a little deeper on what does it mean when we say that when the New Testament authors write Scripture has been fulfilled through this event or that event, often in the life of Jesus. How do we understand the nature of the fulfillment of prophecy? And how did the New Testament authors interact with the Old Testament writings? And so I want to revisit a passage we looked at on Sunday. It's in John 17:12, and it says, "While I was with them," this is Jesus speaking, "while I was with them, I protected them and kept them safe by that name you gave me. None has been lost except the one," and in the NIV it says, "doomed to destruction," so that Scripture would be fulfilled. On Sunday we simply talked about how Judas, although on the surface it can appear that he was just set up to fail, he had no choice in the matter. That's not the way God operates. God desires that none should perish, but all should be saved. And yet God gives us free will. I mean, his Spirit is acting before we respond, but we can choose to align ourselves with God or to distance ourselves from God and his kingdom. And through a series of unfortunate choices that Judas made, those choices molded and shaped his character. The choices we make always shape and mold our character. And it was the case in Judas's life that the free choices that he made, shaped him to become a character who would be suitable to betray Jesus. I would argue that he was not predestined to fulfill this role. Jesus does not set up anyone to fail. He loves the entire world. He gave his life for the entire world, and yet he gives us free choice to either respond or to resist his calling and his invitation that is open to everyone. But it says so that Scripture would be fulfilled. And the question I really want to dig into for the next few minutes is, what does it mean and what does it not mean when the New Testament authors talked about the fulfillment of Scripture or the fulfillment of prophecy? What is the nature and the understanding of prophecy in a broad sense? And so I want to look at three other passages of Scripture, two from John and one from Matthew, and look at the passages that they are referencing in the Old Testament to try and make some sense of this. Because I think in our contemporary evangelical world, we've often misunderstood the nature of prophecy, and it can lead to some dangerous and misguided conclusions, in my humble opinion. And so let's look first at John 13:18. John 13:18, again, this is Jesus now, the night before he was betrayed. during the Last Supper with his disciples. This is the context of this passage. And he says, I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen. But this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. And there's that phrase again, fulfill this passage of Scripture. And then Jesus quotes an Old Testament passage as written by John. He says, he who shared my bread has turned against me. He who has shared my bread has turned against me. And obviously, during a meal where he's sharing bread with his disciples, he's referring to Judas, one of those 12 who would soon betray him, actually later that night. And so, again, the question is, well, what is this passage quoting? So we go back, and if you have a good study Bible, you'll probably have a little footnote in John 13:18 that cross-references Psalm 41:9. And we go to Psalm 41:9, we read, in the Psalm of David, he says, even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. Now, if we were to read that passage on its own, in its context, I submit to you that there's no hints or clues that Psalm 41:9 is a passage predicting something that should or most definitely will occur in the future. It's simply David recounting some life experiences in his life. And in fact, the verb tense in Psalm 41 is talking about something that has already happened. It's not predicting something in the future. It's talking about something in the past. It says, even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who I had shared my bread, has turned, past tense, against me. And so the reality is, if no one that Jesus had shared his bread with had betrayed him, we wouldn't be thinking, oh, when is that Psalm 41:9 going to be fulfilled? When is that predictive passage going to be fulfilled? Because there's nothing in that passage to suggest that it's a future-oriented passage. It's merely David talking about his life situation and someone who had betrayed him and is calling out to the Lord, his lamenting to the Lord as his enemies are betraying him. And so that should cause us some pause. It should cause us to scratch our head. Second passage I want to look at, John 19:28-29. This is Jesus now on the cross saying, later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge on it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. We're familiar with this passage, many of us. Again, the fulfillment of Scripture. What is the passage that is being referenced here in John? What is the passage that Jesus himself is referencing? Well, once again, it comes from the Psalms. This one comes from Psalm 69:21, and we visited this very briefly on Sunday, which says, they put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst. And again, this is past tense from the perspective of the psalmist. And gall basically was a type of poison. And so the psalmist is saying that someone had poisoned his food and gave him vinegar for his thirst. And yet Jesus recounts this passage saying that something on the cross was this particular event of Jesus being given this wine and vinegar was fulfilling this passage of Scripture. But once again, there's nothing predictive in Psalm 69:21 if you take it on its own terms and you read it in its historical and literary context. There's nothing there that should make us think, wow, when is this passage going to be fulfilled in the predictive sense of the word fulfilled? There's nothing that would give us pause. If this never happened on the cross, we wouldn't be waiting and we wouldn't be looking back and saying, hey, that never happened. Why didn't that happen? It's only as Jesus connects that particular event to the psalm that he says in some way, shape, or form, there's some fulfillment of Scripture happening. Maybe your head's spinning and maybe you're scratching your head by now. Let me just give you one more example and then we'll try and make sense of all this. Matthew 2:14-15. And this is Jesus' birth as he's a child now in the context of Herod trying to snuff out all of the young children because he thought his throne and his kingship was being threatened by this king of the Jews, Jesus. And so maybe many of you will recall the story that Joseph and Mary were given a heads up. An angelic visitation told them to leave to go to Egypt. And in that context, we read this in Matthew 2:14-15. So he, Joseph, got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And again, if we look back, what passage is that referring to? And this time we don't go to the Psalms, we go to one of the minor prophets, in particular Hosea. In Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, we read this: "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And once again, there's nothing on the surface of that Hosea passage to suggest that this is a predictive prophecy saying that something that should or most definitely will happen in the life of Jesus. The prophet Hosea is merely referring his audience to God's faithfulness in calling and leading Israel literally out of Egypt during the Exodus story, that when Moses led the Israelites out of bondage. And yet, once again, the author of Matthew feels the need to connect this passage to what's happening thousands of years later in the life of Jesus. All three of these authors use the word fulfillment of Scripture. And so if these passages and many others aren't talking about a fulfillment, like a crystal ball sense of fulfilling something that was predestined to happen in the past, what do the authors mean when they use this term, fulfillment of Scripture? What are we to make of this? How are we to understand this? What gives the New Testament authors the liberty to play fast and loose with the Old Testament passages, to rip them out of their context, and to give them a meaning that they didn't have initially? When I went to Bible college, this was a no-no. You don't interpret Scripture by ripping it out of its context, and it appears that the authors of the New Testament, John, Matthew, Jesus himself, are doing just that. So what's happening here? Well, it's important to understand some of the literary techniques in the first century. And one of those literary techniques that was common in that day and age, it's uncommon today, but 2,000 years ago, was something called Jewish Midrash. And what Jewish Midrash was basically a commentary. The contemporary writers, the biblical writers, and the Jewish writers, both before and after Jesus, they would comment on some contemporary events in their time. And what they would do is they would highlight those events that illustrate principles and to make connections to the stories of the Old Testament. And so when we see these New Testament passages, the three I read and others, saying they fulfilled a certain passage in the Old Testament, we should not primarily think like the Greek mindset and like our modern contemporary Western mindset. We should not think of predictions predestined to occur, but rather we should think of illustrative connections being made between Jesus and the Jesus story and the story of God's redemption in the Old Testament. Fulfillment of prophecy is primarily done then not as foretelling, although there is predictive prophecy in Scripture. I'm not saying there is no predictive prophecy, surely there is. But more often than not, the fulfillment of prophecy is primarily done and said after the fact. It's retroactive, where the writers of the New Testament, they make connections to make the point that Jesus is the climax of the story of God's redemption. Everything happening in the Old Testament is on a trajectory climaxing in Jesus and the cross. And so the New Testament authors and Jesus himself are wanting people to connect the story in the Old Testament to the person and the work of Jesus. Not in a predictive, fated, predestined, micromanaging God type of picture, but saying that the thrust of God's redemptive story finds its climax in Jesus Christ. And that's what the New Testament authors they're trying to make the point. They were trying to raise up the person of Jesus to their mostly Jewish contemporary audience at the time using that technique called Jewish Midrash. They were making commentaries, much like not an author in a children's story. I've got a children's story here. Much like there's not simply words being written, but there's illustrations in the book. And the illustrations add a fullness. They connect the words on the page to the meaning of the story. Much in the same way, the New Testament authors were making those connections. It's almost like those are the illustrations of the larger story of God and how Jesus has been a part of that story all along. And the whole story's been on a trajectory fulfilled, given its fullness And so when we hear the word fulfill, we should think that Jesus gives the fullness of the story. And then as we go back and read, we can see that God has always been working on a course in his story of redemption. And so I hope that makes sense. I hope the reason I wanted to flesh that out is because sometimes we try and defend Jesus. At least I've been guilty of this. We try and defend Jesus by going back to some of these passages that I've gone through today, and we make a case that, hey, Jesus is the real deal because look at all these Old Testament prophecies, these predictive prophecies that he fulfilled. No one else could do that. And while there are certainly things that Jesus did that fulfilled in the traditional sense some of those Old Testament passages, if I try and use these passages I've shared today to make a case for Jesus, I have and will continue to have people laugh in my face because they'll say, oh, that's not a predictive prophecy, and they're right, it's not. And so I think the better way to defend Jesus, the primary way we defend Jesus, is to let our lives show that Jesus is at work in us, and to understand and to make connections. Just like those authors made connections between current events, we can help people make connections to what's happening in their life to illustrate the fact that God is real, God is with us, and God looks like Jesus. And so none of us are fated. The future is open, and God is guiding the course of history in the direction he wants it to go, but he gives us freedom of choice to choose, and I pray we will all choose this day to align ourselves with his way and his kingdom. So God bless you guys. I hope that makes sense. If you've got any further questions, bounce me an email, give me a call. Love to keep wrestling through this stuff together. All right. God bless you guys. Have a great day. Bye-bye.